Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to examine a very timely issue in Oklahoma, the English-only movement. And you need to pardon me, this is a little bit of a rush job because this is something of current importance and I wanted to be sure to get a program on about it right away. I haven't had time to research everything as much as I would have liked to. The reason it's so timely is that there's an initiative petition that was recently submitted to the Secretary of State and forwarded to the Supreme Court for verification of the signatures. It's called State Question 689, and if certified, it'll be on your November ballot. If approved, it will add a new statute to Oklahoma law, which has a great bearing on language in this state. Now, of course, the Wordpath show is sort of about anything but English. We always focus on other languages than English. So what's the relevance here? I hope I'll be able to explain tonight what bearing, if any, an English-only statute in this state might have on Indian languages. I think it is important for us all to pay attention to it. Let me start first with a little bit of history on the English-only movement in general. And also on the English language in this country. So let's go back even a little before that. In the founding era in our country, say in the late 18th century, Declaration of Independence, writing of the Constitution and so forth, I think it's worth noting that at that time there were lots of English speakers among the populace, but there were lots and lots of speakers of other languages too, people who preferred other languages and lived their lives mainly in other languages. And yet the founding so-called fathers saw no need whatsoever to establish any official language. They saw no danger in this. They were, after all, founding a new nation, conceived in liberty, etc., dedicated very largely to individual rights and the right to people to be diverse in religion, political beliefs, and so forth, and not have the federal government lorded over them on some of these issues. These were some of the very issues that caused them to come to this country in the first place. So it's interesting that there was no English-only movement at that time, or at least if there was any movement, it was not successful. It didn't make any significant impact. In fact, at that time, many governmental documents were published not only in English but in other languages, especially in German, because the founding convention, of course, was in Philadelphia, and there were quite a few German speakers in that area. There was even some of this, I think, is myth, but there was some discussion of having German be the official or one of the official languages of the United States. But it was decided to just let well enough be alone, let the people mind their own business linguistically. My, how times have changed. In 1983, someone who was, at the time was a one-term, had just retired from being a one-term California senator named S.I. Hayakawa, founded an organization called U.S. English. This was in 1983. Let me read you, at the time I was living in California where he was very active in talking about these issues. And I got a fundraising letter from the U.S. English organization. Let me just read you a couple of excerpts to give you sort of the flavor of the times and what was in his mind when he thought it was necessary to found such an organization and to be concerned about the status of the English language in the United States. It opens, "Dear friend, during the 6 years that I served as a United States Senator, I realized that our country was heading towards a crisis that no one seemed willing to address. We have unwisely embarked upon a policy of so-called bilingualism, putting foreign languages in competition with our own." This term foreign language is going to be very important in tonight's discussion. Think about what that means, Indian language advocates. I'm going to skip down a couple of paragraphs here. He says, "Having retired from the Senate, I have now launched a national public interest organization to establish English as our official language. We have named it U.S. English. Its purpose is to restore the English-only ballot." There were, in many communities in California and in a few other states at the time, there were mandated multilingual ballots where there were sizable non-English speaking populations, low literacy rates, and there were a few other qualifying standards. But in a number of communities, including, for instance, Los Angeles, ballots were published in Spanish and I believe in other languages as well. Let me go back now. Its purpose is to restore the English-only ballot and to limit bilingual education to a transitional role. In other words, we don't want any of our kids growing up speaking two languages. That's very un-American. If we've got some foreigners here and they want to They're mandated by the federal government to do some bilingual classes in the beginning to transition them into English-only usage. Well, we might permit that, but that would be about the limit of it. We don't want any bilingualism among adults. We want everybody to be mainstreamed into English only as they grow and progress through the school system. Next paragraph, I'm skipping a little bit here. Dr. John Tanton, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, T-A-N-T-O-N, a practicing physician and well-known leader of many civic causes, is working closely with me. Dr. Tanton is highly experienced in handling such organizations. Under his leadership, U.S. English is rapidly growing into a powerful countervailing force to the special interest groups pressing for language separatism. Language separatism. To speak more than one language is to want to secede from the United States, I suppose. Or he would have you think that. I'll tell you a little bit more about this Dr. John Tanton in a minute. Next paragraph, and this is the third little excerpt I wanted to read from this. Please join me in this important endeavor. Help us put together the money needed to wage a vigorous campaign to restore English to its rightful place as the language of all Americans. I hope you can make a generous contribution, et cetera, et cetera. Tax contributions are fully tax deductible. It's a nonprofit organization, or it was. I think the organization still exists. So this was a very important figure in the beginning of this modern English-only movement, S.I. Hayakawa. He's sometimes referred to as a linguist, but please. He was never a member of the LSA to my knowledge, and I checked the membership rolls many times. And the LSA, this is the Linguistic Society of America, the main professional linguistics organization in the country, in fact, passed a resolution opposed to English-only movements and the types of laws that he was advocating. He was a semanticist. I don't know much about his work because it was never highly regarded when I was studying linguistics, so I never read any of it. But to call him a linguist is a little bit misleading because most linguists in this country are opposed to the English-only movement. He, on the other hand, co-founded it with Tanton. Let me say a little bit more about this guy, Tanton. Hayakawa referred to him as a physician. Well, he did have an MD, but he was an ophthalmologist, not very good qualification for making pronouncements on language. He didn't know much about language, but he knew a lot about, for example, zero population growth. He was one of the leaders at some time in that. He was very worried about the growth of the population, and in particular as it meshed with another one of his big concerns, which was the growth of immigration, both legal and illegal. He was also one of the founders, I believe, or certainly influential in an organization called FAIR, Federation for American Immigration Reform. You don't need to read too much between the lines to figure out what he was really up to, and Hayakawa seemed to be hand in hand with him in this. He wanted to keep the Mexicans out, and he thought one good way to do it would be to exclude them from participation in public life by excluding their language. He was alarmed that we were being sort of overtaken by the Spanish-speaking hordes. They were going to multiply. I mean, there are some outrageous quotes. If I had had the time to find them, he did use phrases like multiply like rabbits. I mean, he was quite an outstanding racist in all the organizations he worked in, as far as I know. And this English-only business was just one of the many ways he thought that he could give certain minorities that he was very afraid of a particularly hard time in life. Now, since this time, there have been English-only proposals both as amendments to the U.S. Constitution. None of them have passed yet, but it's been brought up several times, and as amendments to state constitutions in many states. It was discussed in the legislature in Oklahoma some years ago as a legislative discussion among our state representatives and senators, and it was defeated at that time partly due to the influence of people complaining about possible threat or at least insult to Indian languages in this state. I knew it would be coming back. I've been telling people for years, they'll be back, they'll be back. Well, they are back. Critics, one thing during this recent history, since the late 70s, early 80s, when this English-only movement has really picked up speed, one of the things that critics have faulted it with is to say that, well, as you can tell from the Hayakawa quotes, I think, it doesn't sound so much as though you're pro-English. It sounds more like you're anti-bilingual education, anti-any language but English, anti-diversity, et cetera, and I think he certainly is. I mean, that certainly is true of this movement or many people in it. It certainly is there in the roots of the movement. But critics have also faulted people who espouse English only by saying, well, if you were so in favor of English only, Why is it, for instance, in California, where this has been a hot topic for many years, why is it that there are always waiting lists for English as a second language classes? If you want to bring people into the mainstream, if you're really not trying to exclude them, if you're really trying to bring them in a brotherly sort of way, why don't you teach them English? Why are you opposed to funding for English language instruction and opposed to bilingual education? The only conclusion I think we can come to is that they are trying to, or they were at least in that context, in that time, trying to exclude people from public life, not to include them. So the window dressing is very fraudulent, I think. And in fact, there's an organization called TESOL, Teachers of English as a Second Language, which is the major national organization in that area. And they have also passed resolutions opposed to the English-only movement and kind of sounding the alarm about the dangers and some of the hidden agendas of this movement. In 1987, there was a cultural rights amendment proposed to the Constitution, which really basically got nowhere. It basically said, hey, what needs protecting here is the minority cultures and the minority languages. And there was a proposal to amend the Constitution to guarantee rights for the minority cultures and languages, and basically it got nowhere. So this whole movement, I think, is based on a number of false assumptions. Some of them are just strictly caused by a lack of good information from linguistic science. Some are just based on racism and other ugly feelings. And some are just people not thinking things through too clearly, thinking, official language, English, well, isn't it already? Why not? I'll vote for that. No, just sort of mindless following the herd. Let me address a few points individually. One of the assumptions is that what makes us all American is the English language. Hayakawa has said this explicitly on many occasions. We wouldn't be Americans if we weren't united by English. We would just be a hodgepodge of he sneers at this metaphor of the salad bowl. You know, there's this melting pot image of Americanization, which is a big movement started in another period of high immigration and high fear among the Anglo majority. In the early part of this century, Henry Ford and other fascists really promoted this idea of the melting pot. You want to come to this country, fine, but you're going to melt. You're going to melt into the mainstream. You're going to leave all your old ways behind. You're going to completely break your ties with your former countries and cultures and become a real American and speak English and act English and dress English and cut your hair like an Anglo-American and so forth. So they thought at that time that speaking English was a big part of what it meant to be an American, and the English-only people think that today too. Obviously, that's not true. I think anybody that has any experience in multilingual communities, or if you have speakers of other language in your own family or know families like this, you know that some of the most patriotic and finest Americans are people who speak generally English, because that's just, as a practicality, everyone in this country learns at least a modicum of English. You have to, really, to get along. But they speak not only English, but some other language. And they don't speak the other language because they can't speak English. They speak the other language because they love it, because it's part of their heritage, it's important to them, they revel in it, it's part of their culture, their literature, their songs, and their entire way of life. It goes with their food and their dance and their social life and everything else, and they love it. That's why people in this country, for the most part, who speak more than one language, do so. Because of love of the language, not because of hatred of English or inability to learn English or anything like that. Although there is this problem of the waiting lists, people wanting to have instruction in English and unable to get it because their governments are not providing it. Another false assumption is this idea that we were always English speakers. Now suddenly there's this onslaught of immigrants, we're being overrun, and English is in danger. As I pointed out already, the United States has always been a multilingual nation. Of course, there were the Indian languages from the start, and we know, we've talked on this show about the efforts to stamp those out, but they have survived, a large number of them. They've been very persistent, so this country has always had many Indian languages spoken in it, still does. There were also other languages. For instance, there were whole annexed parts of this country which, before they were English-speaking and became part of the United States, were French-speaking and Spanish-speaking. Enormous areas of this country. So we've always been a multilingual nation. Another assumption, speakers of a common language share an identity. This sort of recaps the first point, but another way of saying the same thing, that if you speak a common language, you will therefore share your identity more. You will all feel more like you are part of the same country, the same thing. You will think more alike, and there's a real dangerous idea. If there's anything this country stands for, it is not trying to get people to think more alike, believe me. Also, this idea that a common language ensures a more shared identity and thoughts is kind of ironic when you think of how this country was founded. I mean, consider the American Revolution. What language did the people fight? What language did the people speak that we were fighting against? We both spoke English, didn't we? And yet there was some kind of a lack of common identity and shared interest there, wasn't there? So obviously, common language is no guarantee for common anything else. Another assumption seems to be that Americans are incapable of true multilingualism. If you read a lot of these tracts put out by English-only people, they seem to say that the way to get better at English is to give up your other language. Now, again, linguistic science has proved this decades ago, proved this to be false. There are lots of good studies showing that if you grow up bilingual, you will be better at English than the people who grow up speaking English only. I mean, this has been proved with school tests or, multi-year studies. There's just no question about it. Study after study has proved this. Seems that the human brain is such that the more you stimulate it with language input and multilinguistic language input, the more it kind of rises to the occasion and becomes really good at language, including the English language or any other language that the child has learned while they're growing up. Another assumption is the best way to make people feel more American, whatever that is for government to dis and or repress their language. If you think about that, it doesn't take a genius to see that this naturally would not be true, even if you've only spoken English all your life. Imagine if someone was putting you down for speaking English and saying that you should speak the language which is predominant in the country and that the government is now going to do all their business in, and so forth and so on. And would you react by thinking, oh, that makes me feel more like a part of this country? Or would you just feel like you've been disrespected? I think you would feel disrespected and, if anything, disconnect from the common national identity more if your language and culture were being repressed. Think about it. Do Indian tribes that have lost their language feel more American, so-called? Or do they just feel more ripped off? A little bit of case history here, and here I'd hoped to develop this more, but I didn't have time to do all the research. But let me just say in general, throughout these last few decades when this movement has been picking up speed, coming and going, there have been sort of basically two tacks. One is to frighten people about civil unrest and about losing their language, saying, if we don't nip this in the bud, English will soon be a minority language and your culture will be threatened. Saying this to the vast, vast, vast majority of Americans who speak English perfectly well and know very well that it's a majority. It's not a majority world language, but it's one of the leading, most international languages there is. If there's any language that is not threatened, it certainly is English. And its status is doing nothing but rising in the country and in the world from day to day, just from the natural effects of business and government and everything else. It is absolutely not endangered, but this movement has tried to make people think that it is. There's also this idea of, well, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, excuse me. So there has been some, I guess what the English-only people would consider successes. For instance, the multilingual ballots in Los Angeles County were discontinued due to the influence of this movement. And yet there have been some movements in the other direction too. Some of what English only wants would certainly be, I think, sort of trumped or negated by the Native American Languages Act, which we mentioned on the show before. It says, for instance, this is the Act of 1990, that the government will encourage and support the use of Native American languages as a medium of instruction in order to encourage and support Native American language survival, equal educational opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. It has very positive statements about native languages and yet not exactly very good guarantees, but there is that as a sort of contrary influence. We also, Intertribal Wordpath Society and some friends tried to get a measure through the legislature in Oklahoma this year called Oklahoma Indian Language Heritage Protection Act. It didn't make it this year, but we'll try again next year. And we're talking about Oklahoma Indian languages. These are languages that really genuinely do need some protection. Now, I would like to read through this act. I wonder if I'll have time. I may have to skip around some. The current initiative, State Question 689, reads, and I'll skip a little bit, Section A, in order to encourage every citizen of this state to become more proficient in the English language, thereby facilitating participation in the economic, political, and cultural activities of this state and of the United States. The English language is hereby declared to be the official language of the state of Oklahoma. I don't think people not being good enough at speaking English is a major problem in this state, and I don't think the proponents of this measure do either, but they would have you think so. Section B, except as otherwise provided in subsection C, blah, 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 all official documents, transactions, proceedings, meetings, or publications issued which are conducted or regulated by, on behalf of, or representing the state and all of its political subdivisions shall be in the English language. So Oklahoma will not be allowed, for instance, to publish anything in the Cherokee language, even though it may be useful, say, in eastern Oklahoma among people who don't speak English very well. And there are still a few communities where there are people like that. Section C, languages other than English may be used when required by the U.S. Constitution, the Oklahoma Constitution, federal laws, or federal regulations. Also, languages, that was number one, other than English may be used when required by, 1, the U.S. Constitution, etc. 2, any state-supported common school or institution of higher education of this state, subject to rules governing the use of foreign languages, there's that word foreign again, in such public education systems adopted by the State Board of Education or the Oklahoma State Board of Regents for Higher Education pursuant to the provisions of the blah, 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 to promote the following principles, and here come the principles. D. On and after January 1st, 2001, any state monies appropriated or designated for use to print or translate reading materials, etc., into any language other than English shall not be expended for such purposes. I don't think that's a problem. Again, I don't think the state government has been appropriating money for publishing things in other languages. Again, if I'd had more time to do research, I could make a definitive statement on that, but my impression is that Oklahoma does not spend much and probably not any of its money on such projects. But this act suggests, just to summarize it a little bit, that where such money has been allocated, it needs to be returned to the state, to the General Revenue Fund. E, at the beginning of the second session of the 47th Oklahoma Legislature, the Office of State Finance shall prepare a report for the governor specifying the total amount of these monies that have been designated for printing things in Spanish or other languages. They need to report to the governor and the legislature about all this money, and which will now be available for reappropriation or redesignation. All monies received pursuant to the provisions of Section D of this section may be used, note the word may, be used to fund English as a second language programs. They're trying to answer that criticism from the last couple of decades that, hey, you're saying you're pro-English, but you're not funding any English instruction. So they're claiming in this initiative that they will be funding English language instruction with returned money from these foreign language projects, which as far as I know don't exist or are very few and far between. F, the provisions of the section shall not be construed to limit the ability of any citizen, state employee, private business, or corporation to exercise their rights pursuant to 1, the Constitution of the United States of America, or 2, the Constitution of the State of Oklahoma. And that could be an issue, although I think this measure is worded more carefully than some of the older ones in the past. It does not in any way say that you're not allowed to express yourself in some other language, just that the state cannot pay for any of that, publish anything, translate anything, et cetera, et cetera. Proponents are Ron Kirby of Lawton, Oklahoma, and Carol Martin of Comanche, Oklahoma. And they and friends circulated petitions and got about 100,000 signatures signed. The status right now is that this has been submitted to the Secretary of State and then forwarded to the Supreme Court for verification of signatures. In summary, what could be the bearing on Indian languages here? Well, you'd have to question a number of things, and there are a number of things in the wording of the Act that are not really clear, so I don't know, but I just want to raise some alarms about some possibilities. The Historical Society is storing some language tapes for tribes. If they copy or convert some of these tapes to other formats for safer keeping, does that constitute the state publishing in another language? It sounds to me like it certainly could be interpreted that way, and they might be barred from doing that kind of work. Can the Department of Education support the teaching of Indian languages? It does fund the teaching of Indian languages in a number of Oklahoma schools now. Would this be allowed or not? The exception in the Act only refers to foreign languages, not to Native American languages. It seems to say you can teach English and certain foreign languages, but not native languages. It certainly is open to that interpretation. Can the Museum of Natural History not do language exhibits if they put a sign up in Cherokee? Is that publishing in another language than English? Sure seems to me it would be, and that might be outlawed. Can OU not continue its Indian language courses? Probably the Regions of Higher Education clause would allow that to continue. And what about other languages? Is Spanish, for instance, really to be considered a foreign language? After all, it was spoken in Oklahoma, I think, before English was. Will this limit bilingual education programs in this state? Looks to me like it might very well. And of course, we haven't even mentioned the possible effect on users of American Sign Language, which is a major means of communication of the deaf. It all comes down to how you define published, because there's no standard writing system for that, so there probably wouldn't be written sign language documents that would be an issue. And what about Spanish speakers, of course, and Vietnamese, as well as the Native American issue? There are many speakers of other languages in this state. In 1987, a counter-movement was founded called English Plus, which holds that the national interest can best be served when all persons of our society have full access to effective opportunities to acquire strong English language proficiency, plus mastery of a second or multiple languages. English Plus rejects the ideology and divisive character of the English-only movement. Not unlike the approach of some American Indian tribes, I might note, where distinct tribal languages were respected and maintained, and plain sign language was used as a kind of lingua franca when people needed to communicate across language lines. How much do I have left? About 2 minutes? Even less. I wanted to give some bibliography. Let me at least mention this one book, which I think is the best single reference in this area. It's by James Crawford. It's called Language Loyalties, a source book on the official English controversy. University of Chicago Press, 1992. There's another one by Conklin and Lurie, A Host of Tongues, Language Communities in the United States by the Free Press. And there's the English Plus Information Clearinghouse. I think we have the address on the computer, and we could show that. And what I would like you to do, we're not going to make new shows for the next 2 weeks, and the timing on any complaints about this initiative things may happen very quickly. As soon as the initiative is verified and published, you have 10 days to complain and to challenge the initiative. So contact the Supreme Court and the Secretary of State and your local representatives and see what you can do. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana